This video describes a friend's clever, unpublished escape from East Berlin and our 1978 road trip there, sleeping 4 up in a tiny minivan. The escape was secret because initially the East German authorities were not even aware that it had happened. Then, when our friend's absence was revealed, they didn't know how it was done. Our friend, who for this video I will rename as Dieter, had qualified at a Berlin university as a doctor, but decided that he wanted to escape to the west. Thinking he would never be able to return, he decided to visit as much of the east as possible. To fund this travelling and the purchase of any fake documents he might need, he began buying small antiques and selling them to Western embassy staff who could take them out without being searched. On one of his travels he arrived in Prague airport at the same time as a flight from West Berlin. He checked the timetables and discovered that this was a regular occurrence. It gave him an idea. On his return he bought an expensive, genuine West German passport that had been smuggled in on the black market and had the photograph expertly changed. He also bought some genuine West German clothes. He then repeated his Prague trip, but before going through the entry control he visited the toilets and disposed of his East German passport in small pieces down the lavatory. Then, using the West German passport, he joined the queue of the West Germans entering. This ensured that, importantly, he was recorded on the computer as having arrived from the West. He spent a couple of days as a tourist visiting places and collecting receipts. Then he booked a flight and flew out to Tempelhof in West Berlin unchallenged. There he met friends who arranged a flight and transferred to West Germany. He was soon able to work as a doctor in Göttingen. Dieter married a West German girl and carried on dealing in antiques as a sideline. At the time, my wife Rosalind was selling antiques in Bath, and that was how we met him and later visited him in Germany. We come now to our plan to visit East Berlin. Following my earlier videos, we'd moved from Hampstead to Chiswick and had 2 children, and then moved to Bath, where I'd taken up a new job at the university. We had a long wheelbase Land Rover, which we used for holidays in the UK. However, wishing to begin foreign trips again, we needed a more economical vehicle. We discovered that minivans were cheap to buy and could be fitted with side windows. Our first expedition was an incredibly cheap Easter 1977 trip to Amsterdam, which cost us only £40 all in, fuel, ferry, and food which we took with us. Each night we slept, all 4 of us, in the back of the van. To say it was snug would be an understatement. As you can imagine, the wheel arches were a problem. We followed this in summer 1977 with a camping trip to France and Spain. This taught us that in the sun the dark green Mini got too hot, so we sold that one and bought a white one. Again we cut out the side panels with a monodex cutter and fitted windows. As you can see, I still have one of the panels. The other one was used as raw material for some project or other. 1978 was during the Cold War, so the Eastern Bloc countries were a bit of a mystery. We decided to begin a sequence of visiting them all. Buying the house in Bath had practically bankrupted us, so there was no money for luxuries. We didn't take a tent, and as in the Amsterdam trip, all 4 of us had to sleep in the tiny minivan. At night, we blanked out the windows with black dustbin bags, held in place with magnets. I still have 12 of those magnets, but dustbin bags probably ended up in some Malaysian rubbish dump. We slept on cushions in the back, Rosalind and I in the middle, and the 2 children, aged 7 and almost 5, slept either side. We were frightened of asphyxiation, so kept the windows slightly open. Every internal inch of the Mini was used. We'd stripped out all the interior trim from the body, roof and doors. It left large compartments in the doors that could carry our water container, a can of engine oil, the jack, our petrol cooker and cooking tin, plus bundles of spare parts. Beneath the rear cargo area were 2 large compartments. One carried the spare wheel and all my tools and the rest of the spares. The other, a large cardboard box with our food, eating utensils, medical kit and so on. When travelling, the children had to sprawl in the back on cushions. There were no seats for them. If in these days of EU-inspired regulations you find this a little shocking, perhaps I should deviate for a moment and relate another expedition involving our parental irresponsibility. We needed some sand to seat a number of paving slabs and set out in the Land Rover for a nearby beach, armed with a couple of shovels. We loaded the Land Rover about a foot deep, and the children built sandcastles all the way home. We still had the Land Rover and sometimes used it for travelling green lanes. Once on Hayling Island we made a repeat of our Tropolino trip and went down a disused railway line by mistake. I'll start now on the trip. Day 1. We set out for Dover in the Mini, but managed to run out of petrol, luckily within sight of the garage. Rosalind steered and the kids and I pushed. Petrol was expensive in France, but cheap in Germany, so we put in what we thought would get us to Germany with a small reserve. We had booked a hovercraft crossing, Dover to Calais, for the following day, so we parked up and had our first night in the van. Day 2. In the morning we made our way to the Eastern Dock and boarded the Princess Margaret, an SRN-4 hovercraft built by Saunders Roe. In 1981, during bad weather, the Princess Margaret hit the Dover Wall. There were 4 fatalities and the hovercraft was badly damaged. Our crossing was quite calm and took about half an hour. However, it was noisy and the spray stopped you seeing anything out of the windows. However, our journey had begun. This map shows the rest of the route. The drive through France and Belgium was uneventful. We crossed the border into West Germany on the autoroute and started looking for a petrol station. However, to our consternation, there were no border services. The fuel situation became critical, so we left the autoroute only to find that the town petrol stations were closed for the night. We had to stop, so we pulled into a garage, parked at the end of a line of their cars and settled down to sleep. Day 3. In the morning we discovered that we were next to a bus queue. The passengers looked a little surprised when we set about removing the dustbin bags and clambered out. After refuelling, we returned to the autoroute and made good progress. At intervals we stopped at services and exercised our legs. It was cold and windy. Going through the industrial zone of the Ruhr, the traffic was heavy and we felt a bit vulnerable in our Mini. Sardines in a can were mentioned. We decided to delay entering East Germany until the following day, so pulled into a services near Hanover to sleep. Starting in 1967, the inner German border between the Federal Republic of Germany, the west, and the Democratic Republic of Germany, the east, underwent serious upgrading. Nearly 1,300 kilometres of new fencing was built, mostly further back from the old barbed wire fences. It consisted of expanded metal barriers, anti-personnel mines, and anti-vehicle ditches. The previous wooden guard towers were replaced with concrete towers and observation points. This reduced the number of direct escapes from approximately 1,000 per year to 120 a decade later. Day 4. There were 3 road transit routes across the GDR to Berlin. Each was very rigorously defined and policed. Any diversion incurred severe penalties. We crossed at checkpoint Alpha between Marienborn and Helmstedt. The formalities were thorough, but there was none of the interminable delays that we'd got used to in the Middle East. At intervals along the route we passed propaganda roadside posters. This one was headed Waffenbruderschaft aus Klassenbruderschaft geboren, which translates as Brotherhood in Arms, born from class brotherhood. This was a central slogan between the communist states of the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet equivalent of NATO. It seems to depict a Russian soldier and an East German one. Another was headed Solidarität hilft siegen. Literally, solidarity helps to win. The transit was about 100 miles, and we entered Berlin at Dreilinden in the American sector, checkpoint Bravo. Perhaps I should explain the changes in Germany's borders due to World War II. As you can see from the map, Germany lost territory in the east and west to Poland, and an inner border was set up between capitalist West Germany and communist East Germany. However, this left Berlin, the previous capital, 100 miles inside East Germany. The powers agreed that Berlin should become a special case, and was divided into sectors: American, British and French in the west, and the Soviet sector in the east. In June 1948, West Germany introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, and this also applied to West Berlin. Stalin saw this as a provocative move to undermine the Soviet zone and blockaded all land transport. He hoped to starve West Berlin into submission and absorb it into East Germany. However, the air corridors remained open, and the West started bringing in supplies via what was known as the Berlin Airlift. This was an incredible operation and lasted from June 1948 until September 1949. It involved hundreds of aircraft with a total of 277,000 flights, delivering over 2.3 million tons of supplies. Eventually Stalin gave up and a small number of land routes were negotiated. In May 1949, West Germany became the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, and in October 1949, East Germany became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and theoretically the Soviet occupation ended. However, West Berlin was heavily subsidized by the FRG, and the GDR had little real independence. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built, primarily to stop the brain drain of the GDR citizens fleeing to the west and undermining its economy. The official reason was to protect against fascist elements entering East Berlin. Initially, this division was poorly constructed, and in some areas simply a barbed wire fence and rough concrete blocks. The translation in this diagram says, "Whoever attacks us will be destroyed." In the early stages, there were numerous escape attempts. Many were not successful. This photo shows a memorial to the 18-year-old Peter Fechter, shot during his attempt in 1962. Over time, the wall became more and more sophisticated, and nearby buildings were demolished. By the time of our visit, there was a wide barrier with concrete obstacles, mines and watchtowers, manned by armed guards. We spent some time looking over the wall from various spots and directions. It was very windy, so we searched for a sheltered spot to cook an evening meal. There was an isolated small shop close to the walls selling mementos, films, etc. The doorway looked ideal, so we decided to wait until it closed. We parked nearby and waited. A military police patrol passed but ignored us. It grew dusk. The shop closed and we got out our petrol stove. The doorway was quite effective and we had no problem cooking our meal. When we were packing up, the military police returned. The shop was obviously on the route of a regular patrol. They were incredulous at our activity and said that night it was a dangerous area and ordered us to leave. We really liked the look of their lightweight Land Rover and years later bought one of our own. The lightweight was a throwback to the American Jeep and Series 1 Land Rover. Designed to be air portable, every non-functional feature was eliminated. Our lightweight was bright yellow and came off a Cornish military airbase. It had a rag top, but we bought a short wheelbase 2A with a really good hard top, swapped the hard top over and then sold the 2A. We hated the way Land Rovers changed from a strictly functional device into the Chelsea tractor Range Rover of today. Its original go-anywhere four-wheel drive often relegated to such tasks as taking little Jason and Sophie to playgroup. However, it's the way of the world. The Rolex GMT Master Watch, a tool invented in 1954 for Pan Am pilots to be able to check the time in 3 different time zones, has morphed into the hideous gold or platinum diamond encrusted £100,000 status symbol versions available today. We moved away from the wall and found a more suitable area, parked up among a row of cars and carried out our dustbin bag sleeping conversion. Day 5. In the morning we discovered that we were near a small park and the children clambered over the attractions. We could see the West Berlin radio tower in the distance. This was our day for a lightning tour of the delights of West Berlin. We started with the Kurfürstendamm. During the Weimar era, 1918 to 1933, this had become a grand boulevard with cafes, jazz clubs and luxury shops. However, when the Nazis came to power, the Jewish shops were closed, their owners expelled, and the area lost its spirit. During World War II it was severely damaged, but by 1978 it had made a recovery and was again a bustling hub of entertainment and shopping. At one end was the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, or at least what was left of it. It was built between 1891 and 1895 and became a focal point for Protestant worship until 1943, when a British bombing raid destroyed it. All that was left was the tower and its broken spire. After the war it was planned to demolish it, but Berliners protested and it was left as a symbol of the horrors of war. In 1961 a new church was built alongside and a new tower constructed, housing a chapel. This view shows the church before its destruction. Our next destination was the Tiergarten, a large park at the centre of West Berlin. In some ways it's similar to Central Park in New York. During the winter of 1945-46, most of its 200,000 trees were cut down for fuel, leaving only about 750 to 800, and much of the land was used to grow potatoes and vegetables. However, in 1949, 250,000 young saplings were planted. They were donated from across Germany and flown in during the Berlin airlift. One of the park's landmarks was the Victory Column, built to celebrate Prussia's victory against Denmark in 1864. However, commemorations of victories in 1866 and 1871 were added. The Nazis moved the column from Königsplatz, now Platz de la Republik, to its current spot and increased its height. The column is topped by a bronze statue of Victoria, the Roman goddess of victory, known irreverently as the Golden Goose. Our next destination was the Reichstag. It was built in 1894 for the German Empire's Parliament. In 1933 it was severely damaged by a fire. Hitler blamed it on the communists, and it gave him a pretext to seize dictatorial powers. Further damage occurred in World War II. At the time of our visit it was derelict. Repairs didn't start until German reunification in 1990, and it finally opened in 1999. We'd considered visiting Spandau Prison to see the highly ritualized changing of the guard. However, we discovered this only occurred on a specific day at the beginning of each month, so we gave it a miss. After World War II, the Nuremberg trials had 7 of the high-ranking Nazis to Spandau, but by 1978 all of them except Rudolf Hess had been released, due to termination of their sentences or ill health. In the later years the Western powers tried to have Hess released, but the Soviets wouldn't agree, so he was kept there at great expense. In 1987, at the age of 91, he committed suicide by hanging himself. Rudolf Hess had been Hitler's deputy since 1933. This photo was taken in 1935. In May 1941 he flew to Scotland in a Messerschmitt 110. He parachuted out with the intention of negotiating peace with the Duke of Hamilton. When this was rebuffed, he was imprisoned until the Nuremberg trials. Hitler passed it off, saying that Hess was deranged. However, recent discoveries suggest that Hitler was aware of the attempt and hoped to remove Britain from the war prior to his invasion of the Soviet Union. Day 6. In the morning we decided it was time to visit the Eastern Zone. We parked the Mini and could have taken the U-Bahn railway. This travelled between the Western and Soviet sectors. It's quite extensive and has some interesting stations. However, we decided to walk to Checkpoint Charlie. In the early days there were several daring escape attempts here. A crafty pair of escapees hired a Healy Sprite car, removed the windscreen and reduced the tyre pressures, and added a wall of bricks to protect against possible gunfire. They made a dash for freedom by driving under the barrier. However, the obstacles became more complicated and made this route virtually impossible. There were many other escape attempts, including tunnels and a hot air balloon, but it became progressively more difficult. Our first destination east was Alexanderplatz. This is the site of the Palace of the Republic, built in 1976 but demolished in 1990 reputedly due to asbestos contamination. The palace held a GDR parliament, theatres, restaurants, bowling alleys and shops. Behind the palace was a 368-metre television tower, still the tallest structure in Germany. The spherical area at 203 metres can be reached by a high-speed lift and contains an observation platform and a revolving restaurant. An amusing story is that when the sun shines it forms a cross reflection, which the locals refer to as the Pope's Revenge. In this photo is a 1971 Czech-built Tatra 603 parked outside the palace. These cars were only used by the Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi secret police, or the top echelons of government. The first version of the 603 came out in 1956. It had an air-cooled 2.5-litre rear engine that produced 99 brake horsepower. It was supplied to friendly nations such as Cuba and China. One was even supplied to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Even higher-ranking officials used Soviet-made ZIL limousines, powered by 7-litre engines. These were based on the American Packards of the mid-50s. President Erich Honecker later used a ZIL 115 limousine for state occasions. We next had a look at the Alexanderplatz U-Bahn station. A popular feature was the world clock. Although it was not intended, it gave the people of East Berlin a feeling of internationalism. There was also a building under restoration, but we were not sure what it was. Dieter had given us the address of a cafe that he used to frequent and the names of a couple of his friends. He asked us to visit it and tell them that he was okay. We did this, but understandably the friends were very suspicious and denied knowing Dieter. Our next port of call was to see the Brandenburg Gate from the east. Until the wall was built in 1961, it was possible to travel between the Soviet zone and the Western zone without a problem. This photo shows the Brandenburg Gate during that immediate post-war period. This aerial view shows the arrangement of the wall around the gate. We had no plans to stay in the Russian sector overnight, so before dusk we returned to the American sector via Checkpoint Charlie without incident. We found a secluded place to park and spent the night in our luxurious accommodation. Day 7. In the morning we decided to visit the Berlin Zoo. The zoo was founded in 1841 and opened to the public in 1844. It became a leading zoological institution and at its peak had almost 4,000 animals. During World War II it was badly damaged, and when peace came there were only 91 animals left. In the colonial past it displayed indigenous people, for which it was later condemned. After World War II it regained its former importance and was in competition with the East Berlin Tierpark Zoo, started in 1955. The entry to the gorilla area was guarded by a black granite statue of Bobby, who arrived at the zoo as a young lowland gorilla. He was a much-loved occupant who had lived there from 1928 until 1935, when unfortunately he died of appendicitis. This photo shows the ornate entrance to the park. We spent most of the day there and then returned to the Mini and cooked our meal. Day 8. Since this was only an Easter trip, our time was short, so this became our day for leaving Berlin. On the way back I wanted to see the four-masted bark Passat, which is moored at Travemünde, near Lübeck, so we took the northern of the 3 transit routes. The Berlin checkpoint was the Heinrich-Heine Strasse. It catered for mainly goods and postal transport, West German citizens entering East Berlin, and diplomats. In 1962, 3 men from East Berlin attempted to crash through with a truck. The guards opened fire. The driver was hit but managed to complete the crossing. Unfortunately, he died, and the 2 passengers suffered serious injuries. The crossing was then made more difficult. On our journey there was very little traffic, and we saw more tractors than trucks. The villages were pretty grim, and there seemed to be a shortage of paint. We saw none of the roadside posters that were placed along the central transit route. The countryside was bleak, and we passed the odd seemingly abandoned mansion that had once been the centre of an estate. There were 2 possible exit checkpoints. I can't remember which one we took. Photography near the checkpoints was forbidden, so I don't have a record. However, I have been able to find some contemporary pictures, so I'll describe both. The main crossing connected the East German village of Horst to the West German town of Lauenburg. It was known as Checkpoint Harry. As I write, all that is left is the concrete tower, which advertises a restaurant of the same name. There was a more northerly crossing which connected the village of Selmdorf in East Germany with Schlutup district of Lübeck in West Germany. This crossing seems not to have been given a name. The border itself was heavily fortified, with several fences, a so-called death strip, and vehicle obstacles and watchtowers. In Travemünde we found a place to park, cook our dinner, and sleep not far from the river. Day 9. The main object in Travemünde was to see the four-masted bark Passat. However, we found ourselves near a small park, so our children Alan and Martin had a run around and rode on the attractions. We found a tourist office in the town and inquired about visiting the Passat, which was moored on the opposite bank. They told us that that time of year it was closed. However, I decided to try and talk myself aboard. Rosalind and the children stayed in the town, since we thought I would do better by myself. I'd had a long-term interest in the history of the four-masted barks built by Blohm and Voss of Hamburg, and originally owned by the company of F. Lights. They were known as the Flying P-Line Fleet, and included the Pamir, the Peking, the Padua, and the Passat. This photo shows the Pamir. They were large steel ships nearly 400 feet long, and used to transport guano, which was nitrate-rich, South America to Europe to be used as fertilizer. The cargo was battened down below deck, and the crew lived in deck houses. This gave them a degree of safety when rounding the dangerous Cape Horn. By 1930 the P-ships were uneconomical compared to steamships and motor vessels. Gustav Ericsson bought some of the ships and knocked down prices, and operated them with cadet crews as bulk grain carriers and in the Australian wool trade well into the 20th century. Unfortunately, the Pamir was lost in 1957 in Hurricane Carrie, about 600 miles southwest of the Azores. Only 6 of the 86 people aboard survived. The Peking is restored as a museum ship in Hamburg. The Padua was renamed as the Krusenstern and continues to sail as a Russian sail training ship. This brings us to the Passat, launched in 1911, and after a checkered career since 1960 is held as a museum ship in Travemünde. I approached the ship, which, as the tourist office said, was closed to visitors. However, after a few minutes of relating my knowledge of its history, I talked my way aboard, and was allowed to roam at will and take some photos. Satisfied, I returned to the town and found Rosalind and children. Not so easy in those days before mobile phones. We cooked our meal and slept in the van again. Day 10. We set out for Ostend. Up to this point the Mini had performed perfectly, but now it decided to show it was not to be taken for granted. It became very jerky when changing gear. I had experienced a similar symptom with our previous Mini and knew where to look. At the back of the engine is a short engine steady strut with rubber bushes. These bushes had failed. Luckily, due to my earlier problem, I had some replacement bushes in my kit of spare parts. It was a simple job to fit them, and we were soon on our way again. The journey to Ostend via Hamburg, Bremen and Dortmund was about 460 miles, a bit much in the Mini, so we broke it at Münster before we got into the complication of the Ruhr. Day 11. We completed the journey to Ostend, but decided to sleep again and get the ferry in the morning. Day 12. There was no problem in getting a ferry. In fact, we went on one of the first voyages of the Prinz Albert. It had been brought into service early due to damage to the Prinz Laurent when it had collided with the quayside in Dover in February 2, 1978. The journey home to Bath Eastern was about 200 miles, and we completed it easily via the M20, the M25 and the M4. So ended our first trip to Berlin. Subsequent journeys were made in nearly new Ford Estate Sierras and later a Mondeo. In later years we saw 2 more four-masted barks. When travelling from Sweden to Finland we saw the Pommern, saved at Marienham in the Åland Islands in 1957. This is appropriate since Marienham was the home of Gustav Ericsson. The Pommern is the only four-masted bark in its original form. On a trip to New York we saw the Peking, before it was moved to Hamburg. Sleeping four up in a minivan was challenging, but it made several of our trips possible and memorable. This is the end of the video.